just like and see. Okay, so we're going to start today with Eisenhower. Not Eisenhower. I'm just making my notes about Eisenhower. We're going to start with Roosevelt. So Roosevelt is, of course, extremely important president for American Jews in a lot of ways. I mean, extremely important president in American history. But in a Jewish perspective, he's quite important. And that importance has shifted over the last several decades. You know, it's generally positive, but there's another perspective as well. So let's start with just some basics. Roosevelt obviously comes from a sort of storied American family, immigrants from Holland, a Dutch family going back to, the 1600s in America, born into a wealthy family, becomes involved in politics in New York, so has Jewish connections from the very beginning of his presidency, and has good relationships with the Jewish community. He's elected president in a sort of very historic, trying time in 1932, in the midst of the Depression. And so in general, from the very beginning of his presidency, Roosevelt had a lot of support from the Jewish community. I mean, he had a lot of support from the larger community as well, because it was seen as a time of crisis. He was seen as a person who would act to help the economy, to help people, and so was captured a large percentage of the Jewish vote. In fact, in 1932, 82%, that's the estimate, they didn't keep as good track then, but 82% of the Jewish vote went to Roosevelt. It would reach as high as 90% in 1940. So he already had a good sense of support. His sort of closest advisors within the Jewish community, one was Stephen Wise, Rabbi Stephen Wise, who had formed a relationship with Roosevelt earlier when he was involved in union work in New York City. That Stephen Wise had helped after the Triangle shirt factory, when there was a lot of unionization in New York State. Stephen Wise was seen as a champion of the union. Roosevelt was impressed with his activities, so they formed a relationship there. Just in general, supporting positive social legislation. However, interestingly, Roosevelt and Wise also had, there was a lot of tension, and this is even before we talk about the Holocaust. Wise wanted Roosevelt, especially after he was elected president, to remove the mayor of New York City, Jimmy Walker, who was extremely corrupt and sort of was the head of Tammany Hall, which was sort of the New York political machine. And Roosevelt didn't do anything about it. And Wise and other ministers and so forth really pressured him, and Roosevelt finally ultimately cut Wise off for several years and said, "Stop bothering me about this." Ultimately, they mended ties a few years later, but there was already some tension in that relationship. Roosevelt was also quite close with Felix Frankfurter. Now, you've probably heard of Felix Frankfurter. He was a Supreme Court justice, but even before he was a Supreme Court justice, he had a positive relationship with Roosevelt. Frankfurter was a fascinating individual. Unlike Brandeis, Frankfurter actually grew up more observant in an observant Jewish home in Vienna. And he really was sort of Orthodox up until the family moved to America when he was 12. That was in 1894. They lived on the Lower East Side of New York. He ultimately, Frankfurter, ended up going to Harvard Law School, was an outstanding student, and was kind of mentored by Louis Brandeis. Brandeis took a great interest in Frankfurter, Frankfurter was, right after graduating from Harvard Law School, a couple years later, he was appointed a professor at Harvard Law School and taught there. And what was interesting about Frankfurter is really from the very beginning, he was involved in sort of political activities. First in Zionism, he attended the Paris peace talks after World War I and was kind of a legal advisor to the American Zionist movement. Because by that time, Louis Brandeis was already on the Supreme Court. So Frankfurter kind of filled that role and was involved in other causes. Primarily, what was it? Frankfurter, some of his influence on Roosevelt was that a lot of his students from Harvard Law School ended up serving in the Roosevelt administration, were mentored by Frankfurter. So when Roosevelt had his brain trusts, so these were the people that helped sort of create the New Deal, Social Security. A lot of them had gone to Harvard Law School and had been taught by Felix Frankfurter. So that was a kind of way he influenced Roosevelt. In addition, I mean, ultimately, Roosevelt appointed Frankfurter to the Supreme Court in 1939 when Justice Benjamin Cardozo retired. Interestingly, one of the people who urged Roosevelt not to appoint Frankfurter was Arthur Sulzberger, the publisher of the New York Times, who didn't want the Supreme Court to be seen as having a Jewish seat. But Roosevelt felt very strongly that Frankfurter would be an excellent Supreme Court justice, which he was. And quite interestingly, both Frankfurter and Brandeis continued to work with Roosevelt while they were on the Supreme Court, which really wouldn't happen today, but both of them frequently visited the White House, helped write legislation, helped lobby for legislation while they were serving on the Supreme Court. That was sort of just what was done then. I guess it wasn't, the media was not as involved in covering these kinds of things back then. Another person that Roosevelt was especially close to was Henry Morgenthau Jr. Now, his father, Henry Morgenthau Sr., was served under Woodrow Wilson as an ambassador and advisor. And his son, Robert Morgenthau, was Secretary of the Treasury and had known Roosevelt quite a long time, much before he was president. He was quite involved in post-war Reconstruction. I mean, this is after Roosevelt, but Morgenthau was involved in post-war Reconstruction in Germany and was sort of a really seminal advisor throughout Roosevelt's presidency. And there were many other Jews who were, I mean, under Roosevelt, he was the first person who really had a large number of Jews intimately involved in day-to-day policymaking, in writing legislation, in really serving in the public faces of the administration. And that was in many ways because Roosevelt simply, I mean, what people said about him is that he wanted the best people for the job. This was one of his closest advisors was a guy, Judge Samuel Rosenman, and Rosenman wrote, "I do not believe Franklin Roosevelt, in considering a man's suitability for appointment to office, cared any more about his religion than he did about the color of his hair." So he simply was, it's not that he was pro-Jewish or anti-Jewish, he simply wanted the best people who could perform the work. So as I said earlier, really a lot of Jews were involved in crafting legislation. One of them was Wilbur Cohn, who helped, originally from Milwaukee, who helped craft the Social Security law. Others, I talked about Frankfurter. Felix Frankfurter. Yes, Felix Frankfurter helped draft the Securities Act of 1933 and Securities Exchange Act of 1934, which were very influential in helping kind of create sort of basic banking regulations. A couple other important advisors. I mentioned Stephen Wise. I mentioned Joseph Proskauer, who was a judge and he had been Alfred Smith's presidential campaign advisor in 1928, ultimately became a close advisor of Roosevelt. So ultimately, Roosevelt has really his incorporation of Jews. This was a time too. I mean, Roosevelt was president during a time when the federal government expanded tremendously as well. So the government was growing, and there were more roles and more people and more influence, and Jews really played an important role. And what was also kind of interesting is, and this brings us to the next part of understanding Roosevelt, is that this was a time when anti-Semitism was also growing tremendously. The 1930s was a time when anti-Semitism in America kept ticking up every single year. So it was both a plus and a minus for Jews to be so involved in Roosevelt's cabinet. There were many people who would say Roosevelt was a Jew. His original name was Rosenberg. This was there were cartoons of that with that charge. So Jews attaining a higher public profile also led to greater anti-Semitism. Plus, it was a time of economic depression. So Jews became increasingly targeted. Now, what this meant, aside, so that's the positive about Roosevelt. He had a lot of Jews in his cabinet. He was fighting isolationism. He was fighting the Depression. However, Roosevelt did not perceive or did not take seriously the rise of Nazism. And this is abundantly clear from the historical evidence. He minimized the rise of Hitler starting in 1933. He had advisors saying, you should take this seriously. You should speak out about what's going on in Germany. And he didn't. He even as so far as the 1936 Olympics, which were held in Berlin, there were people urging him not to send an American delegation. He did. There were mass rallies at Madison Square Garden in the mid-1930s against Hitler. Did not receive much support from Roosevelt at all. In 1938, there was a conference for refugees, addressing refugee issues from Germany and from Europe generally in 1938. And not one country, except for the Dominican Republic, offered to accept a large number of refugees, including the United States. Simply said, we can't accept them, nor did that conference, nor did Roosevelt support Palestine, which was under the British mandate, accepting Jewish refugees either. So he was completely unaware or uninterested or unfocused on what was happening in Nazi Germany. Was this deliberate? It's very hard to say. It's very hard to, you don't know a person's motivations, especially, he can't defend himself. And many other liberals, including, this is what The Nation magazine, which was a preeminent liberal publication, wrote in 1936. One sees no Jewish heads being chopped off or even roundly cudgeled. The Nation is writing about the Olympics in Berlin. The people smile, are polite, and sing with gusto in beer gardens. Board and lodgings are good, cheap, and abundant, and no one is swindled at all. Everything is clean, and visitors like it all. So essentially, many people were kind of fooled by what was going on in Germany, and Roosevelt was not an exception. The other side of the argument, though, is that he was aware, but chose to ignore. And there's a lot of evidence for that as well. Stephen Wise was very early in being aware of what was happening in Nazi Germany and urged Roosevelt to speak out as early as 1935. He urged Roosevelt to at least relax the strict immigration laws that were on the books in the United States. Roosevelt didn't. In 1939, many of you might know the story about this is 6 months after Kristallnacht, when hundreds and hundreds of Jews were murdered, hundreds of synagogues destroyed. There was a ship called the St. Louis that left Hamburg, Germany, landed in Havana. The Cuban government would not let them in. The ship tried to go to Florida, and the U.S. Coast Guard started shooting at the ship, saying, you can't disembark here. Ultimately, the ship had to return back to Germany, where virtually every person died in concentration camps. Roosevelt didn't do anything. Could have. There were people appealing to him to do that, and he didn't. So that's pre-World War II. Now, even during the war, we know that people were trying to reach Roosevelt and saying, here's what's going on in Europe. Aside from the war, there were death camps, and there were many people. There's a famous Polish diplomat named Jan Karski, who met with Roosevelt through Felix Frankfurter, met with Roosevelt in 1943. And so Karski was Polish, he was not Jewish, he was Polish, and he told Roosevelt exactly what was going on. And Roosevelt simply said, we want to try to win the war, and that's that, and sent Karski back. Karski lived, ultimately was honored as a righteous Gentile. But he said in an interview, he said what he told Roosevelt was, I wanted to be helpful. Well, this is reflecting on what he said to Roosevelt. This is in an interview Karski did in 2000. He said, I wanted to be helpful to the Jews, the oppressed people. I saw terrible, terrible things happening to the Jews. There was poverty. The Jews were treated worse than cattle. They could not travel or walk the streets, but were confined to ghettos and death camps. And then reflecting on Roosevelt, Karski said, President Roosevelt was one of the greatest men in the 20th century, but he was not a Jewish or Polish president. He was an American president who looked out for American interests. So that's an interesting perspective. There was a lot of other criticism of Roosevelt. So just to kind of give a historical perspective, right after World War II, up until really the 1980s, Roosevelt was seen in probably overwhelmingly positive light, that Roosevelt won the war, defeated the Nazis, and ultimately, had so many Jews in his cabinet that he was good for the Jews, that he was a very positive president in American Jewish history. But beginning in, well, really the research started in the 70s, but there was a book published in 1980. Well, actually, it started a little earlier. Excuse me, I was wrong about this. The first book about Roosevelt and the Jews that was somewhat negative was in 1967. And it was called While 6 Million Died, A Chronicle of American Apathy. And it was by a journalist, Arthur Morse, it's a little bit of an extremist title. You kind of tell this is not a history. This was a popular kind of a journalistic book. But he essentially said Roosevelt was two-faced, that Roosevelt would tell his Jewish supporters that he's doing everything he can to help Jews in Europe, but that publicly he has to stay focused on winning the war. And that he wasn't doing anything. Essentially, that Roosevelt was bombing factories that were very close to Auschwitz, but was not bombing the train tracks that were leading into Auschwitz. And he was given advice that you can do this. It's not that the option was never there. The option was there and he chose not to. And he was assuring Jewish leaders that he was doing everything he could, but he wasn't doing everything he could. And then later, really the first scholarly work about this was published in 1980 by David S. Wyman, who's still alive, still runs and was called The Abandonment of the Jews, America and the Holocaust, 1941 to 1945. And in this work, essentially, Professor Wyman says Roosevelt did much less than he could have to help Jews, and that it was the worst failure of his presidency. That he could have, according to Wyman, he could have saved millions of people. In 1944, the bombing of Auschwitz was clearly feasible, and he didn't do it. In and that even the Assistant Secretary of the Army, that essentially what the argument was is that Roosevelt was persuaded he had two options. He had certain advisors, Stephen Wise, so forth, urging him to do more, but he had other advisors in the State Department, the Army Department, who said operations would be doubtful and they don't warrant the use of our resources. And that essentially it would have distracted, that if Roosevelt had done things to bomb Auschwitz or the tracks leading to Auschwitz, that it would have distracted from the larger war effort. And Roosevelt decided to side with those advisors. It's well worth reading that book by Wyman. I read it several years ago. I haven't had a chance to review it since then, but it's pretty persuasive evidence. Again, we can never know the full story. You know, they call it the fog of war. Obviously, Roosevelt had a lot on his mind. There was a lot going on. He did have, and remember, one of the other important things to know about Roosevelt, and just Jews were not that politically influential, right? There were close advisors to Roosevelt, Stephen Wise, Bernard Baruch. But Jews as a political force, there was no AIPAC. There was American Jewish Committee, but they were very behind the scenes. There was no public pressure. Roosevelt is a politician. Politicians are not heroes. Politicians do what's in their interest. Roosevelt did not perceive it in his interest to bomb. These are not moral figures. He did not perceive it in his interest. So we have to keep all of that in mind. But this taints Roosevelt's legacy tremendously. Okay, questions? Yeah, go ahead.
I used to work for a guy whose mother, the Czechoslovakian Jew who survived Auschwitz, and he told me that she told him once that they could see sometimes American planes.
Yeah.
And his mother used to pray that they would bomb him. It would kill her and everything, but it would put an end to that awful place.
That's such a good point. Absolutely. It could have worked. There's no question. That's a great story. Yeah, Sue, go ahead.
I can't remember exactly where I read this, whether it was in a book or an article, but I did read that Eleanor Roosevelt had prevailed upon her husband to please bomb the train tracks.
Yeah.
And he did not listen to her either.
Very possible. Very possible. I mean, she certainly had relationships with the Jewish community. And it's clear that he could have done more. And the question, I think that's really hard to answer is why he didn't. As I said, one reason why he perhaps didn't is that there was not that much pressure for him to do so. You know, maybe Eleanor Roosevelt did. There were certain Jews who would push him, but there were not that many. You know, they're really, and generally things only get done when there's pressure to do them, when there's a compelling reason to do it. They don't get done for more. I mean, just look at history. I mean, look at what happened in Rwanda. Look at what happens all over the world. Look at what happens in Syria. You know, there's lots of death and murder and destruction in the world. And oftentimes nobody does anything about it unless there is a push and compelling reason to do that. And there wasn't that much of there wasn't media covering it like there would be now. So in some sense, there was not the pressure to do it. In another sense, he had advisors saying it's not worthwhile to do it. So that's probably the best explanation. I mean, we can't say he was an anti-Semite. I mean, that would be a very difficult case to prove given how many Jewish advisors he had. One could make the compelling argument that he was quite two-faced, that he would tell people one thing in private and do another thing in public. That he would, and there's a lot of criticism, in addition to criticism of Roosevelt, there's a lot of criticism of Stephen Wise as well, that Wise basically, after the mid-1930s, and ultimately Roosevelt repaired his relationship with Wise in 1936, but Wise never really went out in public and criticized Roosevelt. Wise behind the scenes would ask Roosevelt to do things, but he never publicly, and really nobody did, never publicly said, you need to do more. And that Wise, so one could argue that Wise in some ways was co-opted by Roosevelt, that he would rather be close to power than speak truth to power. You want to think of it that way. And that's an abysmal failure by Wise. Again, it's easy to blame people 70 years later. As a historian, you have to be very careful about making moral judgments about people who are acting in the heat of the moment. However, that's a fair criticism of Wise. Yeah, Marilyn, go ahead.
Yes, we talked last time about the Nobel Prize that he won for the Russia-Japanese war that you discussed.
Theodore Roosevelt, yeah.
Yes, and Theodore Roosevelt gave some of that money to the National Jewish Fund at the time. And then the other thing is that Eleanor Roosevelt, she did try to help the Jews. She wasn't very successful. There was so much negativity, in the government and in the political scene, but she did have some success, and she helped a lot of artists and intellectuals. And that wasn't very much, but within like 1933 and 1945, there weren't very many, but there were about 200,000 Jews that came to the United States. And that was a very small portion, but at least we're grateful.
Very small.
And when they sent back the St. Louis, the vessel, those Jews were turned back, and a lot of them died in the Holocaust,
yes,
unfortunately. And that was so sad. Here they were, they made it all the way here, and they were turned back.
Yes, it's a tragic part of American Jewish history. Yeah, go ahead, Sarah.
I don't know if this is true, but I've read that bombing the train tracks might not have helped that much because they're pretty easy to repair. And if they had bombed Auschwitz itself, it might have shut it down, but it also would have killed the people in Auschwitz. So that might have been a controversial thing to do. So it's not exactly clear to me what targeted things Roosevelt could have done, except that he could have certainly opened the gates of immigration and let people come here. But militarily, already they're fighting pretty much full out against the Nazis. So, with all their resources. So I don't know if those things are true, but I've read that.
That's a compelling, I think that's an important point to make. Yeah, you could argue, and I'm certain, I remember now reading in the book that was essentially what the War Department said, is that it wouldn't be that effective. So that's definitely, you could make that argument. Yeah, Mark, go ahead.
It's also important to remember how powerful politically isolationists were in this country.
Yes.
They had the upper hand, and Roosevelt really had to dance around a lot of things, Lend-Lease, that sort of thing. And of course, a politician's first job is to get reelected. So I think I'm willing to give him a little bit of a pass, because we're looking at it now through the lens of history, but the isolationists really had the upper hand politically until Pearl Harbor.
I think that's a very fair point, and I think that's warranted. It's again, we have to be very careful about judging people in the fog of war. That doesn't mean we can't be critical, but it's also important to understand the larger reality. I think you're right. I mean, really, there was, especially before Pearl Harbor, I mean, there was a tremendous isolationist sentiment in the United States, and Roosevelt could not be, it would have hurt the broader cause if he was seen as being too, solicitous towards the Jewish community. He was already kind of seen as very pro-Jewish because of all his advisors. And so, and remember, even the Jewish community did not want to be critical of Roosevelt, right? I mean, Arthur Sulzberger didn't want Felix Frankfurter appointed to the Supreme Court. And the reform rabbinate at that time is also very, I mean, there are Zionists, but it's generally non-Zionist and didn't want to speak out too much. So in some ways, you can't blame Roosevelt for not doing what even the Jewish community wouldn't do, right? So it's very, the situation of American Jews today is very different than when it was before World War II and during World War II. And we have to be mindful of that. Again, that doesn't mean we can't be critical. There was a lot of problems with how Roosevelt conducted himself, but that doesn't mean he could have done so much more. Maybe he could have, maybe he didn't. A lot of that is just, we don't know. Very tricky. One interesting sort of positive thing about Roosevelt and the Jews is that Roosevelt's great grandson is a rabbi. I'm not sure he actually is serving a congregation, but he studied at the Reconstructionist Rabbinical Seminary. Here's his lineage, is quite interesting. So his name is Josh Bottager. Ashley actually knows him. I think they overlapped a bit. He is a grandson of Anna Roosevelt, who was one of Franklin Roosevelt's daughters. And she married John Bottager, a reporter for the Chicago Tribune in 1935. John and Anna's son, John, married a Jewish woman, Janet Adler. Janet grew up in Frankfort, Indiana. I don't even know where that is, where she and her family were the only Jews in town. Ultimately, though, they moved to Miami Beach when Janet was a teenager. They were not observant, but they belonged to a Reform synagogue. And when she married John, she didn't convert, but they raised their children in a Reform Jewish synagogue. And ultimately, they moved to Western Massachusetts. When he was an undergraduate, he took courses at Bard College, took courses in Jewish studies, ultimately went to study in Israel, and then studied at the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College. So that's kind of neat. That you know, this is the sweep of history is quite long, and there was at least some positives out of the Roosevelt legacy. Any other questions about Roosevelt? Okay, so then Roosevelt dies in office in 1944. I'll know that. And Harry Truman 1945, excuse me. And Harry Truman becomes president. Harry Truman was the vice president. A lot of people didn't think Harry Truman was up to the job, but he was. And Harry Truman, just to kind of go back and look at his relationship with Jews, Harry Truman did not have many Jewish acquaintances, but he did have one strong acquaintance in particular, and that was his business partner, a guy named Eddie Jacobson. Originally, they served in the Army together, and they ran a canteen very successfully in the Army. And then after they left the Army, they opened a haberdashery. The haberdashery failed. It wasn't very profitable, but they remained very close friends. Truman's wife, Bess Truman, was basically an anti-Semite. That's what the evidence suggests. But Truman himself kind of, you know, he got along with people. He was recruited into politics in Kansas City. And ultimately, because of the politics of Kansas City, the way the city was run, he was elected senator, and then he was chosen to be vice president. Again, vice president at that time in history is a relatively unimportant job. It was done mainly so that somebody could get elected, especially with Roosevelt. You know, he had multiple vice presidents over his time. So it was not seen as a very important job. And yet, when Roosevelt died, Truman ascended. One of the first pieces of advice Truman got was to resist Zionist pressure to create a Jewish state. And this was, oh, wow, 5 days after Franklin Roosevelt's death, the Secretary of State sent Truman the following note. It is likely that efforts will be made by some of the Zionist leaders to obtain from you at an early date some commitments in favor of a Zionist program. The question of Palestine is a highly complex one and involves the questions which go far beyond the plight of the Jews in Europe. As we have interests in the area which are held vital to the United States, we feel that this whole subject is one that should be handled with the greatest care and with view to the long-range interests of our country. Now, as you could probably tell hearing that, the note's rather patronizing. And Truman did not take well to that note. Excuse my language, but Truman responded, according to his associates, he responded to that, don't ever trust those goddamn sons of bitches in the State Department. So that's how Truman responded to that letter. So again, you can even tell from that tone of that letter, these State Department officials kind of saw Truman as not very sophisticated and say, there's a lot more complex things going on. So don't, we'll take care of that for you. So Truman has in ways almost much more than Roosevelt, Truman publicly demonstrated concern about Jewish refugees and the Holocaust. This is a speech he gave in 1944, April 14th, 1945, just 2 days after assuming the presidency. He said in public speech, this is amazing, no one can any longer doubt the horrible intentions of the Nazi beasts. We know that they planned the systematic slaughter throughout all of Europe, not only the Jews, but of vast numbers of other innocent people. Their present oppressors must know that they will be held directly accountable for their bloody deeds. To do all this, we must draw deeply on our traditions of aid to the oppressed and on our great national generosity. This is not just a Jewish problem, it is an American problem, and we must and we will face it squarely and horribly and honorably. So that's pretty, Roosevelt never made any statements like that. Truman did. He advocated, starting in 1946, he advocated for Jewish refugees to be allowed into Palestine. But again, the State Department blocked him on that. And he ultimately didn't fight the State Department on that. So essentially in Truman's presidency, there was great contention between the State Department, which did not want to encourage Jewish immigration to Palestine for fear of upsetting Arabs and their oil interests, and Truman, who was much more sympathetic to the plight of Jewish refugees. But ultimately, Truman got a little angry at American Zionists because of all the pressure that was put on him. According to sort of Zionist folklore, Abba Hillel Silver who was a rabbi in Cleveland and was kind of like Stephen Wise was a major Zionist leader. Abba Hillel Silver went into Truman's office and banged on his desk saying, you have to let more Jews into Palestine. And Truman didn't like that. Truman saw it as pompous, as imposing and dishonorable. So Truman, while he had sympathy with the plight of Jews in Europe, did not have sympathy for American Zionist leaders who were putting intense pressure on him to encourage more Jewish refugees. Ultimately, things really came to a head in 1947. So in 1947, we have the expiration, the British mandate is close to expiring. And the question of what will happen with Palestine is becoming more and more prominent. And there's a lot of pressure that Jews in America and around the world are putting on Truman to ultimately say he supports a Jewish state. And Chaim Weizmann is visiting America. We talked a little bit about Chaim Weizmann earlier, Woodrow Wilson, the Balfour Declaration. Chaim Weizmann is visiting America, and Weizmann very much wants to meet with Truman. Truman doesn't want to meet with Weizmann. he says the State Department doesn't want him to meet with Weizmann. And one of Truman has two really close advisors, and they're on opposite sides. One advisor is George Marshall, of course, the Marshall Plan, and he was Secretary of State, very influential, very important, very consequential, totally opposes the Jewish state. But his other advisor, Clark Clifford, who was an attorney and is essentially Truman's special assistant and kind of his all-round advisor. They've been together since in Missouri. Clifford is very supportive of a Jewish state. And the two of them are kind of back and forth in Truman's ear. Ultimately, through pressure from Eddie Jacobson or through appeal from Eddie Jacobson, Truman agrees to meet with Weizmann. And they have an hour-long meeting, and Weizmann is fairly persuasive as to the importance of the Jewish state. And that meeting, it's not a turning point, but it helps cement Truman's feeling that he should recognize the Jewish state. And so actually at that point, it's not about recognizing the Jewish state, it's about permitting more refugees to come in. Here's a funny, according to Truman's diary, he really couldn't pronounce Chaim, as in Chaim Weizmann, so he just called him Cham, and Weizmann liked that. And Weizmann also kind of, what Weizmann did that was quite good was he kind of said, don't worry about what all the American Zionist leaders are saying and the pressure that they're putting on you. I'm here as someone who is on the ground in Palestine, and I'm telling you what we truly need. Ultimately, the United States in 1947, November 29th, 1947, supports the UN partition plan, which recognizes the first time internationally that the Jewish state is recognized as a modern Jewish state. And then when the British mandate expires on May 14th, 1948, within a half hour of that Declaration of Independence, the United States recognizes Israel. And Truman went on to say that it was one of the proudest moments of his life. Here's from his diary. One of the proudest days of my life occurred at 6:12 p.m. on Friday, May 14th, when I was able to announce recognition of the new state of Israel by the government of the United States. In view of the long friendship of the American people for the Zionist ideal, it was particularly appropriate that our government should be the first to recognize the new state. The Soviet Union also recognized Israel right after the United States did. And part of that is just Cold War politics as to where will Israel fall? Will it, as a socialist country, would it move closer to the Soviet Union, or would it move closer to the United States? Ultimately, it moves closer to the United States, but at that time, Israel was not clear. So Truman is considerably, in one sense, much more pro-Israel, pro-Jewish people than even Roosevelt. Now, there is criticism of Truman in that he made anti-Semitic remarks. There's no question about it. I mean, he often referred to Jews as kikes. Now, one could say, was that just Truman often used salty language? You know, that was sort of his. He was not a. The way he spoke was earthy, one could say, and his wife was more kind of social. You know, was sort of an establishment anti-Semite. You know, she didn't like having Jews at her home. And there were clear remarks about that. Truman himself did not have his wife's kind of social anti-Semitism. I mean, clearly from his business partnership, he didn't. But he had one remark about Chaim Weizmann that people often cite. Where is that? He said something like, this was before he met with Weizmann, when he was facing all kinds of pressure to meet with him. he initially refused, and he said, Jesus Christ couldn't please the Jews when he was on earth. So how could anyone accept that? How could anyone expect that I would have any luck pleasing them? So he kind of, one could say, one could say that remark is anti-Semitic, which I think probably it is. However, often got to see it in the broader context of he's facing a lot of political pressure. So in the broader perspective of history, Truman is seen as very pro-Israel, a remarkably important president for the Jewish community. One of his closest Jewish allies and friends is a Chicagoan named Philip Klutznick. You might have heard of him. Philip Klutznick is the guy who built Water Tower Place. He was a developer. In fact, Newton Minow was his lawyer. So this is very interesting Chicago history. Truman maintained good relationships with Jewish leaders throughout his life. One of his also, he had a lot of Jewish supporters. I mean, especially after he retired, he maintained good relationships with the Jewish community. He was presented with Torah scrolls in memory, in honor of his recognition of the state of Israel. So there's a funny story that at the Jewish Theological Seminary, Chief Justice Earl Warren was invited to a dedication at the Jewish Theological Seminary, JTS in New York. And when he arrived in his limo, this is in 1957, sitting next to him was Truman. And Truman came to the convocation as well, to the dedication. And somebody said, how did you happen to come along, President Truman? And he said, well, the Chief Justice invited me uptown for a good Jewish meal. So how could I say no? So, he had positive relations with the Jewish community after his presidency. Yeah, Mark, go ahead.
He was also a very surprising president when it came to civil rights. When he was a young man and he was going into World War I, he came into his grandmother's home wearing his blue uniform, and she threw him out. Said, "Don't you ever come into this house again wearing that uniform." And his family was, I think he made remarks that were disparaging of Black people prior to becoming president. But then when he became president, of course, he integrated the armed forces.
Yes.
And
yes.
he also made a very important speech or comments, I think, involving civil rights during his presidency. So he was just somebody who it turned out to be a pleasant surprise.
Yes, very good point. Very good point. Yeah, we often give a lot of attention to Roosevelt, who was a very consequential president, but in many ways for Israel, Truman was even more consequential. Okay, we'll end with Eisenhower. Now, Eisenhower, of course, succeeds Truman. Eisenhower had sympathy for the Jewish people, primarily because of his experience in Europe after World War II, where he visited the death camps, and he famously was simply horrified by what he witnessed. Here's what he wrote. Here's what he wrote in his diary after visiting a death camp. Now, this was in April 4th, 1945. He wrote to George Marshall. The visual evidence of starvation, cruelty, and bestiality were so overpowering as to leave me a bit sick. In one room where there were piled up 20 or 30 naked men killed by starvation, General Patton would not even enter. He said he would get sick if he did so. I made the visit deliberately in order to be in a position to give firsthand evidence of these things if ever in the future there develops a tendency to charge these allegations merely to propaganda. So he saw the consequences of the death camp. He also, in 1945, unannounced, attended an Army Yom Kippur service. So he assigned a special Jewish chaplain to the DP camps where so many refugees were. That chaplain was a Rabbi Judah Nadick, who ultimately served a conservative synagogue in New York. And he was supportive of Jews in DP camps. You know, there was a lot of restrictions on what Jews, you know, there was a report delivered to Eisenhower that said the German soldiers are treated better in the DP camps than the Jewish former prisoners. And Eisenhower changed that. And so he had, you know, certain sympathies. By the way, it's interesting. Eisenhower, many people in anti-Semitic publications would say he was Jewish. I mean, look at his name, Eisenhower. Ike, our Rabbi Ike. Ike is often associated with a Jewish name. This is according to a historian, because names like Ike and Eisenhower had a Jewish ring to them. Quite possibly, people were led to believe that Dwight and his family were Jewish. This unfounded claim, which persisted throughout his life, did not disturb Eisenhower. And in fact, when he was at West Point, somebody in his yearbook wrote, "David Dwight Eisenhower, the terrible Swedish Jew." So, you know, he in some ways he might have had some sympathy for the Jewish people. Now, when it came to politics, however, there was often tension between the United States and Israel in the 1950s, most famously over the Suez Canal. And in 1956, Israel took control of Sinai and the Gaza Strip. Eisenhower said, "You have to give it back." He constantly urged that Israel withdraw unconditionally from Gaza and Sharm el-Sheikh, and that if Israel didn't withdraw, which they ultimately did, the United States would impose sanctions. Eisenhower was also influenced, again, by the State Department, especially by someone, John Foster Dulles, who basically historians now say was an anti-Semite. I mean, Foster Dulles was a very powerful individual. In fact, so one of his kids, it's kind of not a nice thing, but one of his kids is Avery Dulles, who ultimately became the Archbishop and Cardinal in Washington, D.C., but was the first Cardinal in centuries to be defrocked. I mean, he was literally, not only did he lose his cardinalship, he lost his priesthood because of sexual abuse of minors. I mean, it was awful. Anyways, John Foster Dulles was very pro-Arab and pro-Egypt, and said any kind of support for Israel will alienate our Arab partners and hurt our interests in the Middle East. And he constantly prevailed on Eisenhower. AIPAC was formed during Eisenhower's presidency in many ways to counter the State Department's influence. And Foster Dulles and others became so enraged at the Jewish political lobby that there was a law that was proposed in Congress to prohibit Jews essentially from giving money to Israel. You know, the United Jewish Appeal would collect, as they still do, would collect funds, and a significant portion of it would go to the government of Israel through the Jewish Agency that exists today. There was a bill proposed in Congress that would prohibit U.S. funds from going to foreign governments. The person who ultimately stopped that bill was Lyndon Johnson, now probably for political reasons. And then ultimately Eisenhower backed off supporting that bill as well. So the bill was ultimately killed and didn't go anywhere, but it was supported initially by Eisenhower through support from John Foster Dulles because of the growing influence of the Israel lobby. And so that kind of created tension between the United States and Israel in the late 1950s, especially. One of the people who kind of helped mend those broken ties was a very famous Jewish businessman named Max Fisher, who was from Detroit and was probably the most the most widely known and respected Jewish Republican of his time. He helped fund AIPAC. He helped create the Conference of Presidents of major American Jewish organizations. He helped create the modern Jewish Federation system. I mean, truly remarkable person. And he's also quite famous that his forget what his daughter. I think one of his daughters was gay. Is gay. She's still alive, and she gave a speech at the Republican National Convention in 1992. That was kind of a very brave speech. I forget the exact details, but he quite a remarkable individual. And Max Fisher helped kind of move the Republican Party during the era of Eisenhower closer to Israel, because in that time period, Democrats with Lyndon Johnson and others were seen, and going back to Roosevelt, were seen as much more pro-Israel than the Republican Party. And Max Fisher, during the time of Eisenhower, helped made that closer. And that was part of the mission of AIPAC. That was part of the mission of AIPAC, was to be bipartisan, was to say it is pro-America to be pro-Israel. It doesn't matter whether you're Republican or Democrat. One kind of low point for Jewish the relationship between Jews and American politics during Eisenhower's presidency was the Rosenberg case. We all know Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, who were communist spies. And in fact, it's generally now been proven that they were. From what I understand, that there was a lot of questions at the time whether they truly were spies or not. It turns out they were, but there were the American Jewish community was almost universally opposed to the death sentence that was imposed upon them, and they were seen as scapegoats for kind of all the Cold War tension that existed in the United States. In fact, quite interestingly, one of the greatest defenders of the Rosenbergs was a Reform rabbi named Abraham Kronbach, who taught at Hebrew Union College, who had a tremendous influence on the social justice message of the American Reform rabbinate. Okay, we covered a lot of ground. But anyways, this was a period of starting really under Eisenhower, really starting under Truman, but the Jewish voice in American politics kept growing, and Jewish influence kept growing. And Jews now played a much more prominent voice in American politics than we had in previous generations. So thank you all so much. It's always good seeing you, and see you next time. Yeah.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Rabbi. Bye-bye.
Thanks, bye.
Very interesting.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.